Okay.
Got it. I did not leave the meeting. All right. Thank you, Stephen. Okay, welcome everybody. It's a pleasure to host you today to our virtual Sustainable Change Alliance New Year gathering and conversation. We had planned to do this at the end of the year last year, but as things happen these days, we wanted to respect what's going on in the world and shifted to this virtual version. Still very, very excited to have this conversation and share it with you. We do look forward to getting back to live events as soon as our public health situation allows for it. We have several events planned for this year that are natural outdoor venues, and we believe that we'll be getting together soon in person and enjoying that type of camaraderie. My name is Matt Riley. I'll be your host today for a conversation what we've titled as "What Happened at COP26." I am a Sustainable Change Alliance board member. I'm the CEO of Infinity Renewables, the president of SCA Solar. Some of you may have seen that conversation that we had here with the SCA. And I'm also an advisory board member for Dignity Moves, which is a homeless housing effort that we also did another talk on there. So some of you have seen me on here a couple of times. I'm a graduate of the Brennan School of Environmental Science and Management, as well as an undergraduate from UCSB. And like I said, I'm delighted to be bringing this discussion to you today. A brief description of the Sustainable Change Alliance. It's an impact-oriented, member-based, not-for-profit educational group. We're focused on impact investing, which we define as bringing financial and other resources to double and triple bottom line organizations that are trying to address big social, environmental, or health-related issues, and trying to do that in a sustainable manner. Some of these organizations are for-profit, some are nonprofit, and some come from the independent sector. I'd also like to acknowledge the hard work and dedicated SCA board members that are on the call today. I see many of you on Zoom. And I also like to congratulate Cheryl Mills-Engler for her new position as SCA board chair. Cheryl's in there somewhere. Thank you, Cheryl. I know I'll fake clap too, so that it sound. And a big thank you also to Stephen McIntosh for your leadership this past year. I think we all know how hard it has been to be a leader of anything this past year, and we very much appreciate that. That one I'm going to make a little noise for. I also want to express my gratitude to all of the members on the call today and everyone attending. This organization is all about engagement, and we very much appreciate your engagement in this conversation and all of our past and future conversations. And then finally, we couldn't do any of this without our sponsors, our founding sponsors. A big thank you to all of them. Our founding sponsors are Argyle Capital Partners, Impact Family Office, Maps.com, Solgenics, and the Tobes Group. Our platinum sponsors are Nixon Peabody Law Firm and Cottage Hospital. And our silver sponsor is Brashears Insurance, my insurance company. Yeah, Jared. If you're not yet a Sustainable Change Alliance Foundation member, we encourage you to join our organization and join us on this journey. Visit sustainablechangealliance.org, where you can sign up as a member. And as a board member, I'm actually in the membership committee. And so if you have any questions, call or email me. And Linda, maybe put my email in the chat box. And so if anybody wants to email me, please feel free to email me and ask me questions about the organization. And lastly, a little bit of logistics. This meeting is being recorded. All participants are on mute except for our guests and myself. And we have a chat room that already has 2 comments in there. I better open it up. I very much invite and encourage everyone, if you have a question, no matter what it is, please put it in the chat. And we're going to have a section of this conversation at the end dedicated to answering some of those questions. But before we start with the core conversation, in the spirit of expanding all of our collective experience, I've asked a friend of mine to highlight what a special local stakeholder is doing to address climate change. The issue is so big, we need significant efforts on many, many fronts. Michael Chiakos is the Director of Climate Policy at the Community Environmental Council. And for those of you who don't know the CEC as it's known, it is a regional nonprofit that fights way above its weight class. Its vision is putting the Central Coast and California on track for an equitable, climate-safe future with an ambitious plan for how our community can meet this urgent moment, go all in together, and halt the climate crisis. Michael, you want to say a few words?
Yeah, thank you, Matt. It's really nice to be here. I'm really looking forward to the conversation about addressing the climate crisis on the international stage. And CEC, as you've heard, works on the climate crisis from that regional perspective. And we're a 50-year-old environmental nonprofit based in Santa Barbara. And many of you have probably heard of us over the years working on different environmental solutions. But in the last 15 years, we've focused entirely on energy and climate solutions. And so this is everything from pushing forward 100% renewable electricity goals and carbon neutrality targets, for example, for the city of Santa Barbara, to forming the Regional Electric Vehicle Readiness Group, to working on renewable electricity. And then we also have programs that work on sequestering carbon in our working and agricultural lands, and then preparing for the adaptation that we know we'll have to do. So pretty much working on anything climate related. If any of that sounds exciting to you, we're also in this high growth phase right now where we're implementing a new 5-year strategic plan. We recently launched a $15 million, we're calling it Reverse, Repair, Protect campaign. So reverse and mitigate our carbon emissions, repair by sequestering that carbon, and protect our communities with adaptation. And so we launched that campaign to fuel this work. We're already about halfway towards that $15 million campaign goal. And we'd really like to just thank Matt for serving on the campaign steering committee, and also to Michael Smith for serving on the honorary committee. So thanks so much for letting me just give a little pitch about CEC.
Thank you, Michael. And I'd like to also mention that Michael is hosting a live discussion with Representative Salud Carbajal on Wednesday, January 26th. That's next Wednesday from noon to 1. I think it's going to be pretty cool to hear what he has to say, specifically on climate. Michael, maybe stick a link to that in the chat room so folks can maybe sign up for that. All right. Okay, now on to the discussion. This is a bit of a different discussion than what we've typically done at SCA. Basically, this came from, I was sitting on the couch thumbing through my Google News and around Halloween, right when COP26 was starting. And I started asking myself, what do I know about this event and how it unfolds? Who are the players? What are the goals, et cetera? Then I started to wonder about all the side conversations that must be happening at this event. And it occurred to me that I knew almost nothing about what is perhaps the most important event for progress against climate change that happens every year. And I'm a climate evangelist and a professional in the renewable energy space, and I know nothing. And so, do I need to go? How can I go? Who even goes to this thing? And what happens? So then I realized that a couple of people very close to me were already there. And so I kept bothering Mary and Michael to have coffee with me when they got back. Bothered them so much that we had coffee the day they got back. I think they were both severely jet lagged. And about 5 minutes into that conversation, I realized that I cannot have this information end with me. This was way too good, way too interesting. I learned everything that I really wanted to know about it. I was learning firsthand from these two friends of mine that had just gotten back from the conference. So it was exactly what I hoped for. And so I am delighted to bring that to all of you. I think you're going to find this to be enlightening. So let me introduce to you our two speakers. First off, Mary Grady has been active in environmental markets for almost 30 years, including 15 years at Winrock International, where she currently is. She is the executive director of the Secretariat for the Architecture of REDD+ Transactions, otherwise known as ART, A-R-T, as well as the executive director of the American Carbon Registry, ACR. She's responsible for the strategic leadership of ACR and its respected team of technical and policy experts in the carbon markets. She actively represents Winrock as the head of delegation as observer NGO, and we'll get to what that means in a second, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, serves on the Council of the International Emissions Trading Association. She's a member of the Task Force for Scaling Voluntary Carbon Markets and serves on the steering committee for the World Economic Forum's Natural Climate Solutions Alliance. I am very excited to host, and I'm excited to out Mary in our local environmental community, because she's an amazing person and an amazing resource. And I was once honored to be part of one of her past teams. So it's a great honor to have you here, Mary. You're a brilliant woman and a dear friend. Thank you for joining us. And we also have with us Michael Smith, who many of you know. Michael is an SCA board member, and has an extensive background in marketing and digital platforms, as well as philanthropic research and impact investing practices. His newest venture, Regeneration VC, is a venture fund that invests capital in the founder teams forging paths toward a fully circular economy. We'll get to what that means in a minute, right, Michael? He has founded and operated media and real estate businesses and enjoyed an extensive career as a global touring DJ. He led numerous environmental initiatives and has been an active investor in early to later stage impact companies. I just want to say, be on the lookout for lots of exciting news coming from Regeneration VC in the coming months, right, Michael? Maybe you can put a link in the chat there to places where people might be able to find that information. So thank you both for joining us. Let's start with you, Mary. Can you start by just giving us a basic overview of how this conference is organized, the different zones, the different parties, just kind of the basic foundation of how the conference runs?
Sure. Well, I may be telling people things they already know, but I think it's kind of important because we have a lot of alphabet soup when we talk about the COP. So, you know, what does the COP stand for anyway, right? So it all goes back to 1992 and the Rio Earth Summit, where the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change was open for signature, right? So we go all the way back at that time. That United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, or the UNFCCC, was the first international treaty to basically combat the dangerous human interference with the climate system. So going back 30 years, we didn't know anything like what we know now, but we knew that something was happening and that we needed to come together as a global community to help combat those consequences. So the COP is actually a COP. It's the Conference of the Parties, and the parties are the 197 governments that ratified that UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. So the COP, the Conference of the Parties, those parties that are governments come together every year to try to make progress. In between, they have meetings and they conduct technical analysis and reports on the state of the climate emergency, what can be done, where are we, et cetera. So in addition to these parties that are the governments that are negotiating what we need to be doing, there are observer organizations. And so WinRock, my organization, is an official observer. And the observers are observers so that civil society can play a role in what's being decided and negotiated, right? So in the negotiating room, the observers can come in and hear what's being said and also have a voice in the negotiations. So when you go to the COP, there are two zones. There's a blue zone, and the blue zone is where all of the official delegates that have a badge, so the parties and the observers that are accredited, that's where they go. There are official negotiations happening all day. There are official side events happening all day at there's country pavilions, there's private sector things. So it's a huge campus, and it's really a zoo, and you have to get there early and stand in a long line and go through security and all that stuff. So, and then there's the green zone, and the green zone is the place where everybody is welcome. And so you don't have to be accredited by the UN. You don't have to have a badge. There's a lot of activity in the green zone from people who are coming from the private sector. A lot of people from the city in which the COP is being held that year want to come and see what's going on. So both areas are really, really busy, and they're usually kind of located close to each other so you can flow in and out. This year in Glasgow is a little bit different because because of COVID and the restrictions they had on the number of people that could come in, people, once they got in the blue zone, they were afraid to leave. They were afraid they wouldn't be able to get back in again. So, so I actually did not even visit the green zone this year because I was afraid if I left and I had to come back for meetings or for speaking engagements, I wouldn't be able to make it back in. So,
Mary, walk me through. So in terms of total people kind of attending this, what were some of the numbers that were thrown out?
yeah, so there were 120 world leaders that attended, over 40,000 registered participants. So those are accredited, 22,000 parties, so representative of governments, 14,000 observers, 4,000 media. And then I have no idea what the count was for the green zone, but it gives you an idea of everything that was happening. It was really huge. And it was particularly interesting because there was so much uncertainty about whether it was going to happen, even weeks leading up, right? We kept thinking it's happening, but they might pull the plug. But they were so organized with and it's always a little bit of a logistical consideration, but this time with the testing and entry requirements and then the daily testing requirements for all registrants, it was really well done and well organized. And I think everybody was so excited to be together in person for the first time in more than, it's been 2 years since the Madrid COP. It felt like ages. And then, coming in also on the heels of the report that came out in August, the IPCC sixth assessment report that confirmed what we already knew, which is red alert for humanity. We know that we're coming so close to the 1.5 degrees that it's inevitable that we're going to hit it. So how do we slow that down and how do we halt it and reverse it? So the sense of urgency at this COP with that kind of scientific news was, I've never been to a COP that was so urgent and collaborative. And so it was really, really a really great vibe this year.
Fantastic. So Michael, tell us a little bit about the green zone. What was the feel there? Who were the actors that were in the green zone? What was going on over there?
Yeah, so the green zone was pretty amazing to be around and be a part of. The actual green zone was the Glasgow Science Center. So think about it like a big convention center. There were youth groups, there were academic groups, artists, corporates hosting all kinds of events, exhibitions, panels going on, cultural performances, workshops. I mean, it was a plethora of activity, 100+ exhibitors, 200 events, a dozen sponsors. So think about it, kind of like a massive Earth Day gathering, and almost like CES, where there were technologies being showcased. But then outside of the green zone, as Mary alluded to, were dozens of different corporate events, nonprofit events, panels, discussions. So the whole city was really activated in a number of different ways and electric. And each of the different houses, as they were called, had different themes and different things happening. And the interaction between the blue zone and some of the events happening, not just in the green zone, but even externally, were quite exciting because you could find yourself at a dinner table or a round table or a panel with some of the real movers and shakers, just for those of us who weren't within the blue zone.
What I found interesting was some of the news articles coming out of the conference about the private sector presence at this conference overall. I want to get to that in a moment here. What was the let's break it down one more level, Mary. You got to come off mute, Stephen. So he'll bring you off. Okay, there
Excellent.
we go.
Yep, thank you.
What was the U.S. delegation? What did that look like for both of you? Mary, you start. Michael, maybe talk about U.S. private sector green zone presence.
Yeah, well, I mean, first, I would like to state that So the US Department of State leads the US delegation in terms of the negotiations. And the US Department of State and the US negotiators are always seen as being leaders in terms of figuring out ways to forge compromise and do those kinds of things. They're working all night. It's tireless. They also take time to brief US business and industry throughout the event so that we understand the status of the negotiations and some of the things that are happening when the observers aren't there. But besides that, this year was the largest US delegation that's ever been to any COP. In terms of the number of governors from US states, there was a huge legislative participation, senators and congressmen at the national level, also state senators and congressmen. So it really was huge. And then on top of all that, the private sector participation was massive. And so obviously what we need is all the tools in the toolbox, right, to get this done and to have emissions in the next decade is what we need to do in all sectors. And if we're going to do that, we need technology and we need money, right? So as Michael alluded to, that was the thing that was so cool, was to see you have to have the policymakers and you have to have the private sector to, with the technological innovation and the ideas. And there was a lot of cross-pollination, right? So people were learning from each other, and there's a lot of that goes on too, just sitting around the table. And the US, the huge delegation that was there from the US really was to show climate leadership, to show that the US is serious. I was in Marrakesh, which was the day that the election was announced. And it was one of the saddest days of my life to be at the COP when that happened in 2016. And so this event and having so much of a positive presence from US government, everything from local government all the way up to the president, was really important.
Michael, how did you feel the US presence was looking at on the green side, on the private sector side?
Really strong on the corporate side. There was not just participation, there was a lot of sponsorship panels, hosting. Chief sustainability officers from most of the Fortune 500s were there and participating, and a lot of CEOs. As Mary just referred to, GFANZ, which is Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, is it's basically 400 different finance firms representing 130 trillion of assets. I mean, it's a massive movement, and they're looking to align portfolios around net zero commitments, 2030 goals, and set up coordination around science-based pathways within the finance industry. And so being a venture capital firm and getting to be around and see that and know key players within that, they became a story in and of themselves and helped drive things that Mary can probably speak to a bit better, like the Glasgow breakthroughs, which got me excited in terms of just real tactical commitments and focus around steel, hydrogen, agriculture, industries that haven't been as prevalent or spoken to in the same way in previous COPs. So private sector participation in a lot of ways, I was hearing the blue zone is very much looking out right now at private sector and green zone and taking some cues and learning from and integrating voices. And there is a few things that I participated in, which I'm happy to speak about if it's of interest, but roundtables where you have multidisciplinary groups talking about an issue, and some of the output of those discussions were actually inputted into the blue zone and the various dialogues that were happening, and certainly within the context of COP27 and future agenda items.
I do want you to expand on the roundtable, and I want you to give me an example. Before I do that, it's hard to engage in an audience that's fully muted and on Zoom, but I want to ask everybody, if you didn't know, like I didn't know when I had coffee with Mary and Michael, that there was a blue zone and a green zone, give me a thumbs up. Did anybody not know that? Okay, quite a few people did not even know that there was a blue zone and a green zone, which I didn't know either. So we're on the right track, Mary, Michael, keep it going. I think our audience is learning already. Michael, let's drill into something cool and specific. Tell us about a roundtable you're on. What did it look like? Who was sitting around it? What was going on the roundtable?
Yeah, so I participated in two roundtables that I was really excited about. The first was led by a company called Pangaea, which is an apparel brand, kind of like a Patagonia type brand. And they wanted to bring the idea of biodiversity into the discussion within the finance community, and making biodiversity and science-based targets a part of impact reporting and attribution at the company reporting level. And they got together a group of people, related to UN, a number of different global NGOs, scientists, business people, supply chain experts, and so on and so forth. And we went around the table and crowdsourced, if you will, viewpoints on how to do that. And they came away with a number of salient and digestible points, and are publishing a report based on it, and are really looking to move the needle on biodiversity as a topic as it relates to COP27, and to integrate it into things like SASB and some of the other accounting finance standards that are beginning to occur. And it's a non-trivial issue. It's very complex on how you think about keystone species and soil sequestration, carbon sequestration in soil, and microbial counts, and pretty nerdy stuff, pollinators, but it matters, and it was powerful to watch that. Another one was on the food systems, and it was with FAIR. Jeremy Collar, a billionaire Brit, put it on. He's trying to get rid of traditional animal agriculture and activate that. And Rockefeller Philanthropies participated in that, and World Resources Institute participated in that. One of the pushes is to make deforested meat, to raise an awareness around that, right? If you're clearing out a rainforest to raise cattle, that meat should have some sort of a tag to it. Or what if you're growing crops with water, with depleted, underwater basins like we do in the Central Valley? How should that be tagged, right? Is that a climate heavy product, right? And so a lot of interesting discussions around where to integrate that with real-time data and feedback going into the blue zone. And so our thoughts, and I did my best to represent the Central Coast in that perspective, to get those ideas into the discussions. And it was very cool to see how notes were taken, how ideas were disseminated.
So, and those are just two examples. I would imagine that there were countless other roundtables that were happening on different topics. So Mary, those conversations and maybe what the distillation of those takeaways, did those make it then, or were there observers at the table? Did that then make it into the conversations that are happening over in the blue zone where policy is being crafted?
Yeah, and actually, what was being crafted in the blue zone really was the conclusion of the Paris rulebook. So, the Paris Agreement was in 2015, but how you get there, all the different rules of how every country is going to calculate and report its emissions, right? On what time frame, with what common metrics, et cetera. How countries can cooperate to achieve their emission reduction targets. What is the time frame to achieve those emission reduction targets? And does it need to be accelerated? Is it sufficiently ambitious for us to keep on the 1.5 degree trajectory, right? So some of these elements were actually finalized, and they're really in the weeds, right? But they were finalized with the input also of the private sector. So the two key things that were finalized, one is called the transparency framework. And that's what I was saying about common timeframes for reporting, agreed formats for countries to report, the review of those reports to make sure that they're accurate and clear. It's really important for that enhanced transparency framework to be in place so that everybody trusts what's coming out, right? The global stock tape on how we're moving forward is clear. And to be perfectly honest, everybody's afraid of China, right? Are they cooking the books, right? What are they doing? So you really having that framework be in place is really important. That got across the finish line. The other thing that's been lingering for 5 or 6 years is Article 6. And Article 6 is the rules for international cooperation through carbon markets to help countries achieve their emission reductions targets, which are in their nationally determined contributions, right? So every country gets to say, here's our plan for reducing emissions, right? So you set your own targets. It's a very bottom-up approach. But when you take all those together, you want those targets and approaches to be sufficiently ambitious to achieve 1.5 degrees in net zero by mid-century, which means we have to have global emissions in the next 10 years, right? And the reason that Article 6 has been so important is because the analysis that has been done shows that you can achieve multiple times the ambition. So 9 gigatons more a year of emission reductions at a savings of $320 billion by cooperating, right? You're achieving emission reductions where they are lower cost, and then you're able to achieve excess and sell those to somebody else that maybe doesn't have a lot of opportunities to reduce emissions, right? Switzerland is kind of stuck. There's not a lot they're going to be able to do in their small country and tiny economy. But if Brazil can reduce deforestation, right, by a massive amount and sell some of that surplus, then everybody is achieving emissions at a lower cost. And we're going more and we're going faster and we're doing it less expensively. However, there were a couple sticking points on Article 6. One of them is around what's called avoiding double counting. So if Brazil sells its emission reductions to Switzerland, they can't both count those towards their achievement of their targets, right? So there was a large controversy that's been going on for years about how to do the accounting on that. And for any of us that have gone to business school, it's not that hard, right? If you subtract it from one ledger and you add it to the other, right? But the politics around it are really fraught in terms of how you calculate those, the mathematical deductions, how you report them, how you know that what's happening in one transfer is similar to another, which is why the accounting frameworks are important. So there were a number of different things under Article 6 that have been lingering for years. They all got hammered out, and now the rules are very clear. And frankly, according to the negotiators that have been super frustrated every year, they stayed over 4 days in Madrid and were up around the clock to try to finish Article 6 and didn't get there. And they said, thank goodness we didn't get there then, because we got such a better deal this time, because sometimes it just takes time. The negotiations take time. People need to think about how this is going to work and affect other countries. So that was a really great outcome that was largely influenced by the private sector and international carbon markets and the work that we do at the International Emissions Trading Association to help advise and influence the outcomes, so that we ended up with a framework in Article 6 where we hope we're going to actually be able to achieve more faster at a lower cost.
I want to get to how that achievement was then relayed to the general public through the press in a moment. But before we do that, I want to ask you, when you say something got hammered out into 2 weeks in Glasgow, I would imagine that that means there's a lot of pre-conference negotiations that have taken place. Maybe describe that a little bit, and side conversations that happen outside of the room. And they come in and it makes that 1 hour meeting with 30 people much more effective. Is that kind of how that's going, or am I missing, or am I off base there?
Yeah, each country, so the US delegation, for example, the State Department has 2 people that focus specifically on Article 6, right? So those 2 people know every in and out and every word of the text of that agreement, and they understand the positions of Saudi Arabia and the positions of Costa Rica and all the positions and where the problem spots are. And so they spend time throughout the year. They meet, the negotiators all meet several times a year to try to make progress on some of these issues. They might come to us, they have come to us and asked us for information and studies and data and reports to help inform the decisions they're taking and the implications they might have in the real world. But what happens during the COP in those 2 weeks is the first week, the negotiators are getting together in the room and they're writing the text, and they have all these different areas that are bracketed, right? So that you might have a bracket number 1. So you have 3 or 4 options for a way to solve a certain area that's tricky. And those are called the landing zones, right? So here's the landing zone 1, 2, and 3. And what happens over the course of that first week is those landing zones are dispersed out to trusted partners. So we might be part of a WhatsApp group, right? And we get a WhatsApp. Here's the text. You're not in the room, right? But here's the text that's being considered. Here's the 3 landing zones, and we're all typing back. This is good. This is problematic. Here's why, right? What happens is those landing zones get refined, and during week 2, the higher level ministerial people come in, and they're left to resolve the situation. But the negotiators have to brief the ministers, right? And say, we had 5 landing zones, we're down to these 2. Here's the situation. And then at the very end, the ministers really are left to hash out the final text. And you read the text and you think it's not a big deal, but every single word of that text has been negotiated and has a meaning that the negotiators understand that the general public might not.
I just want to sort of pause there because, and I want to shift to Michael for a minute, but I just want to point out that for me, at least, and maybe others on the call here, when you described that to me the first time, I was pleasantly surprised that so much was getting done at this conference, because what I saw as an outside observer on Google News was a speech by Biden and maybe a couple of articles that said nothing's happening, or protesters throwing something at people. And what you're describing is a actually very functional working system for a very complicated international problem that we all need to address. And I think that that's something that hopefully folks here take that away. So the implementation of all of this policy is going to be done by the private sector, or some of it is going to be done by the private sector. And so, Michael, a little bit maybe about what happens. So what were the pledges? What sort of things did you hear about coming out of the private sector that kind of dovetailed into, well, I guess maybe I'm putting the cart before the horse, but I want to talk about what achievements came out of this. So I don't know if, Michael, you want to talk first about that, or Mary, but I want to talk, what achievements came out of the policy and what were the pledges of the private sector dovetailed on that.
Yeah, I mean, and by the way, that was, Mary, really unbelievable to get to that level of detail on how things are actually being done. So that's a rare glimpse. Thank you for that. The methane pledge was the big news early on in COP. It put wind in the sails. It was a big, global coordination of a 30% reduction commitment by 2030. Methane had never been talked about before. And even the way that methane is measured is still disagreed in terms of the carbon equivalent, because it's a shorter lived greenhouse gas. And private sector had a lot of part and parcel to that. Another interesting coordination between private sector and blue and green, if you will, were the cities race to zero, part of C40, which is the big city mayoral commitments and initiatives that have been made. And I would say that Santa Barbara, this touches us a little bit, but it's basically working to raise climate action to limit global temps to 1.5. And it's 34 countries, it's 11 major automakers working together to sell zero emission vehicles by 2040. And so that's on-ramp between corporate and blue green. I was with the chief sustainability officer of Ford as they were making that announcement, and they were quite excited about the potential of that one. The $18 billion pledge to reforestation and habitat loss was another major outcome of the COP. I'm sure Mary has thoughts around that particular piece. But then there were within a number of finance pledges, like I already spoke about with GFANZ, there were more specific ones, talk of even how to better integrate scope 3 emission standards, right? That's become a real big issue in terms of the difference in how you account for that within ESG, all the kind of private market metrics that we're utilizing for carbon measurement and accounting. There was excitement around blockchain and new tools to better measure, verify, share, how those tools might then be fed back into blue zone negotiations to help make more better transparency, like Mary mentioned, and authentication, provenance, and those sorts of ideas. So a whole host of hundreds of different initiatives happening on the private sector, but those are some of the ones that stick out.
And Mary, so I want to get to your thoughts on the takeaways on our last few minutes here before we get to Q&A, but I want to remind everybody, if you have a question, I was a former teacher. I love questions. No question's a bad question. Just type it in the chat and I might ignore it if I don't like it, but type it in the chat anyway, so I can read it and maybe ask it. So Mary, what were the, just our last sort of 5 minutes here before some Q&A, what's your sense of the key accomplishments of the conference overall?
I will answer that, but I also will say that the sense of urgency and collaboration at this COP and the functionality of the negotiations was unlike any COP I've been to before. So other COPs, negotiators spent weeks and weeks and went over days and didn't reach agreement, right? So it doesn't always work, but I think what happened this time was we had the pandemic, we had people wanting to get together and collaborate, we had this IPCC sixth assessment report, and we all know, everybody realized, like, everybody has to come together at every level of society, from governments down to individuals, private sector, public sector. We need money, we need to move fast, and we need to move faster, right? So that all, I think, helped propel the final stages of the negotiations across the finish line. And while I agree with Michael and some of the really headlining financial commitments that were made, that was the one shortfall. We still don't have enough money, right? There wasn't enough money pledged, even though there was a lot. That being said, a couple of the key takeaways that I would say that I thought were huge achievements was the Glasgow Climate Pact itself, right? So this is the accord that comes out of the meeting. Every word of it is agreed by the 197 parties, right? So again, painstaking to go through and have this, but this Glasgow Climate Pact that was published on the last day had some real firsts. So for the very first time, the pact expressed alarm at the rate we're depleting our carbon budget. So it's very clear, nobody's going to argue about it anymore. 197 countries agreed that there's actual alarm. There was a resolve to keep warming to 1.5 degrees. Again, new, because even though the Paris Agreement says, 2 degrees and hopefully better, the countries haven't been willing to come forward and say it is 1.5 or better, right? It's actually 1.5. And that means that we need to have global emissions by 2030 and achieve net zero by mid-century. That is in the Glasgow Climate Pact. Again, a first. There was a notice that there's enhanced urgency to update the nationally determined contributions, so the country's plans to reduce emissions. Those aren't due. Yet they're supposed to be updated every 5 years. New nationally determined contributions aren't due until 2025, but in the Glasgow Climate Pact, they say everybody needs to redo your NDCs by the end of this year, 2022, to enhance your ambition to align with 1.5 degrees. So again, that's enhanced ambition. Yes, the accord says you have to do it by 2025. The Glasgow Climate Pact says, yeah, well, you're going to be in trouble if you don't do it by the end of this year. Yeah. There was a noticed that we need to accelerate efforts towards the phase down of unabated coal power and inefficient fossil fuel subsidies. This was the cliffhanger at the end of COP, because it said phase out, and India wouldn't agree. And it turned into this literally moment where the president of the COP was crying because this is the one bit. So the negotiation was then to phase down of unabated coal power and inefficient fossil fuel subsidies. But again, a first to recognize that and put it in the pact. And then there were references to methane, which has never been done before, like Michael said, recognizing the role of reducing tropical deforestation. So these things, we need every tool, but no matter what else happens in the economy, unless we reduce methane and stop deforestation, with everything else, we're not going to get there. We're not going to hit the targets. So a couple of the pledges that were really big around forests were the Glasgow Leaders Declaration on Forest, where over 140 countries that represent 90% of global forests said they were going to halt deforestation by 2030, and that's backed by about 19 billion in public and private sector finance. And then near to my own heart was an announcement by this coalition of 3 governments and 19 private sector companies called LEAF, the Lowering Emissions by Accelerating Finance, that they committed. They have $1 billion, and they had received proposals from more than 30 countries to reduce deforestation by paying them for certification under the program I manage, the Architecture for REDD+ transactions. They committed $1 billion, and they got 10 billion worth of proposals. So it really was a call to collective action to raise more money to help reduce deforestation. But the $1 billion itself was really big, particularly when you add it to the 19 billion under the Glasgow Leaders Declaration. So there were new pledges and commitments every day, multiple a day. It was kind of hard to keep track, but usually they're paper, and in this case, there's real money and real commitment behind these pledges.
I mean, it begs the question for me, and I would imagine if I get some head nods from all the other heads in the Zoom, that then why was the press so negative about this conference? It would just felt like we weren't getting that information. All this cool stuff had been achieved. In some ways, some things that were massive breakthroughs on coordination for 197 different countries. And maybe it's an unfair question to ask you why that is, but did you feel it in the conference that was kind of, well, look, we're doing this great stuff, but the rest of the world's just getting this sort of the lens over what they're getting? Because I think that's important for all of us that don't attend this conference to understand that what we're seeing in the news is really not a reflection at all of what's happening actually on the ground at this conference.
Well, I can say, I left my Airbnb at about 6 o'clock every morning and didn't get home until 10 or midnight or whatever, right? So when I would come home, I would have all these texts from my boss saying, oh my gosh, this is terrible. What happened? I'm like, I don't know. I just had a great day. So I really wasn't following the media or the press while we were there. And it wasn't until I got back and was able to read some of what was coming out. And I really don't think it all was reflective of the positive vibe on the ground. I mean, it was really a great conference, great energy, a lot accomplished. And I guess the cynical me, I've been the target of media before, and there's, having a negative story and a hit piece sometimes in the headline is a lot more fun than having a good story. So I don't know. I didn't think that the things that I read when I got back reflected what was happening on the ground at all.
I want to get to a couple of questions here. One of them is related to that Cheryl asked about. There was some news releases, or maybe I'm getting it wrong. I think there was a question there about lots of fossil fuel reps. Craig asked, and I had seen that news as well. And I think I even asked you that question, Mary, when we talked at breakfast. Do you have a short response for that?
That is one of the articles that I did read, because it was a BBC article that they didn't do their research. So they picked up a report that somebody had written that said that the organization for which I serve as the vice chair of the board, the International Emissions Trading Association, had accredited over 100 fossil fuel companies. And so I was at the AIDA board meeting when that came out, and I said, what are they talking about? AIDA only had 154 badges, and 5 of those went to fossil fuel companies.
Yeah.
So it was just completely wrong. Were there oil and gas companies there? Were they on the ground? Yes, they're there. They have to be part of the solution.
Absolutely.
Right?
Absolutely, yeah.
Another
Michael,
interesting, another interesting part of this is there was while you would walk around on the streets, there was a lot of police presence, and there was a great amount of protests happening pretty frequently. And multiple times throughout the day, they would shut down parts of the city, trying to keep it, contained and safe. And for the most part, it was. But it brought a really, at times, amazing and positive and uplifting element, and at other times, it was distressing. And so the media coverage of that, in the context of everything else that was happening, was quite a lot. And in the first couple of days, which is when all of the presidents of the major countries come, it was a very different energy than later on in the weekend, because it's a 2-week event. So how things were coming out, when they were coming out, in the context of all the different agendas as well from these media organizations and countries and other added to it. But for me, there was a really powerful moment. A friend of mine named Julia Jackson hosted with her organization Grounded, where she brought together 40 indigenous leaders, tribal leaders, representing 40% of the world's biodiversity in terms of rainforests and different vital areas of protection. And just to see that group have a real power and a rising power and say, and as Mary just was referring, how do we get funds to them to encourage them to keep these habitats, these vital ecosystems going? It's really beautiful. And they did just to be around that kind of vibe as well. I mean, it was a celebration of humanity for certain.
It felt to me, listening to you guys now, and also in our previous conversation, that a lot of the things, Michael, that you experienced, a lot of that is the fuel that then drives what is going on in Mary's world, right? This is the humanity element that's literally next door, that people are getting together and they're talking and they're discussing and they're protesting and they're partying and they're doing all these things to say, this is important, get it right, and participating in that dialogue also on the policy side. I didn't know that. I don't know if anyone else on the call kind of knew that interaction was taking place at these conferences. I was really encouraged by that. By the way, I'm a little bit worried my daughter is going to be a protester at the COP2032. So hopefully it's at a safe country. Can she carpool with you, Mary? Okay, we only have a couple of minutes left here. Any parting thoughts? Just really, actually, one question I have for you, and we might spill over. I hope we don't. But Mary, Michael, take a step back from your formal roles, the way you went there, and strip yourself back to your personal self. And I just kind of want to know, what does this conference mean to you personally? How do you feel about it personally, and as a citizen of the world and watching this unfold? Mary, you go first.
Gosh, I have to say, the conference itself, I've had a little bit of a love-hate relationship with. I've been a lot of times, and sometimes it makes you feel frustrated, right, that things aren't happening. This year was very different. As a citizen of the world, I felt that it was an absolute rally and could not have asked for anything more. And I was honestly just so excited that I was there to be a part of it. I think that it's one of those decisions. I was kind of a little bit freaked out, like, am I making the right decision to be heading to 40,000 people in the middle of a pandemic, right? And it was the right decision. And it's something that I'm always going to remember. That you meet people, and just walking through the hallways, people are friendly, and people talk to you when you're in line to get a coffee. And it's a great celebration in general, but this year was just was beyond words.
Yeah, I didn't even know if it was going to happen. I had no plan to go. It was 2 weeks before the COP. I had heard hotel rooms were impossible, that everything was sold out, which was all very true. And an advisor to our fund, William McDonough, we were talking, and he said, "Why are you not coming to this?" And I said, I don't have a place to stay." He said, "Stay with me." I said, "Well, what are we going to do?" And he had 2 weeks of events planned and everything. So it was truly by the seat of my pants, booking flights, figuring out how to get on a train there, and then finding myself, with my tribe, like my people that all cared about something as much as I did, and made, lifelong friends. It was a catalytic event for me personally, just to be around that. Very, very hopeful. Of course, there were disappointments, but so much good and excitement. So yeah, I was just grateful to be a part of that and to be a part of this conversation, Matt.
I mean, honestly, just listening to you guys say that, I actually get a little goosebumps. I mean, I'm very happy to hear that there's a very much of a positive feel to that conference. That's kind of what I wanted to get out of the original conversation with you guys. There is an after party to this conversation for SCA members. Please join us, Mary and Michael. I think, Michael, you're joining us in that. I know Mary is. Yeah, okay, good. And then also, I'm inviting everyone here and anyone you want to invite to our COP27 conversation exactly 10 months from now, when we invite Mary and Michael back to tell us what happened in Egypt. And it sounds like half of our board is going to go with them and hang out in the green zone. So a big thank you very much to Mary and Michael. I really appreciate the conversation. And again, thank you. And with that, I think we will end the Zoom, Stephen.